Deep in the fog-shrouded peaks of North Carolina's Blue Ridge Mountains, 16-year-old Ethan Clarke stood at the edge of his family's abandoned cabin, watching the last search helicopter disappear into the gray sky. 3 weeks had passed since the avalanche took his parents and younger sister. 3 weeks since the authorities declared them dead and stopped looking. But Ethan knew something the rescue teams didn't. His grandfather had been a Green Beret survival instructor, and every summer until his death, he'd secretly trained Ethan in ways to stay alive that most people couldn't imagine. Now, with winter closing in and no one coming back for him, Ethan faced an impossible choice: hike down the mountain to foster care and a life he didn't want, or disappear into the wilderness and prove his family was still alive somewhere in these ancient hills. Armed with nothing but his grandfather's hidden journals and a determination that bordered on obsession, Ethan began building something in the towering oak trees, a treehouse that would become his fortress, his sanctuary, and ultimately his salvation. But what drove a teenager to choose 100 days of complete isolation over the safety of civilization? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The wind cut through Ethan's worn flannel shirt as he turned away from the empty sky. The cabin behind him stood like a monument to everything he'd lost: windows dark, chimney cold, silence pressing against the walls where laughter once echoed. Social services would be back tomorrow morning with their clipboard sympathy and legal guardianship papers. They'd already made it clear a 16-year-old couldn't live alone on a remote mountain property, especially not through a Carolina winter that promised to be one of the harshest on record. What they didn't understand was that Ethan wasn't alone. Not really. Every whistle of wind through the pines carried his grandfather's voice. Every shadow between the trees held another lesson in survival that most people thought belonged only in military training manuals. He pulled the leather-bound journal from his jacket pocket, its pages yellow with age and filled with his grandfather's precise handwriting. Maps, plant identification, shelter construction, water purification, all disguised as innocent camping notes to anyone who might stumble across them. But Ethan knew better. These weren't camping tips, they were blueprints for disappearing completely. His fingers traced over a particular sketch that had haunted him for weeks. A detailed diagram of an elevated shelter system, something his grandfather called the ghost platform. Built 30 feet up in the canopy, invisible from ground level, capable of supporting not just a person, but an entire life suspended above the world. The sound of tires crunching on gravel made Ethan's pulse spike. He wasn't expecting visitors until tomorrow. Moving to the cabin's front window, he peered through the dusty glass and felt his stomach drop. A white sedan with government plates sat in the driveway, and a woman in a navy suit was checking her phone, waiting. Margaret Holbrook from Child Protective Services. She was early. Ethan's mind raced through his options. He could walk out there, submit to her questions, sign whatever papers she'd brought, and let them drive him down the mountain to some foster family in Charlotte or Asheville. He'd have regular meals, a warm bed, and the kind of normal teenage life that grief counselors insisted he needed. Or he could slip out the back door and vanish into the woods that had been his second home since childhood. His grandfather's voice seemed to whisper from the journal's pages. Sometimes, boy, survival means making the choice that scares everyone else. The woman knocked, 3 sharp raps that echoed through the cabin like gunshots. "Ethan, it's Mrs. Holbrook. I know you're in there, honey. We need to talk." He closed his eyes and saw them as clearly as if they were standing before him. His mother's gentle smile, his father's calloused hands, his sister Emma's wild curls catching sunlight. The search teams had found pieces of their car in the ravine, twisted metal and broken glass scattered across the rocks, but no bodies, no proof that the family he loved was truly gone. "I'm coming around back," Mrs. Holbrook called, her voice closer now. Ethan grabbed his grandfather's military surplus backpack from the closet and began stuffing it with essentials: the journal, a water filter, emergency rations, rope, his grandfather's combat knife still sharp enough to shave with. From the kitchen he took matches sealed in waterproof containers and the hand-crank radio that might be his only connection to the outside world. The back door creaked as Mrs. Holbrook tried the handle. Ethan shouldered the pack and slipped out through the root cellar exit, emerging 50 yards into the tree line just as the social worker's frustrated voice carried across the clearing. The massive oak that had called to him for weeks stood like a sentinel at the forest's edge, its trunk thick enough to hide a truck, its branches reaching toward the sky like nature's own scaffolding. He looked back once at the cabin, at the life everyone expected him to choose, then melted into the wilderness where his real education was about to begin. The silence hit Ethan like a physical blow, where moments before the wind had been screaming through the trees, now only the gentle whisper of falling snow remained. He stood frozen in the doorway, his breath forming small clouds in the suddenly frigid air that was seeping into what had been their warm refuge. "Mom?" His voice cracked. "Dad? Sarah?" Nothing. The generator had died with his family's disappearance, plunging the cabin into an eerie twilight. Ethan fumbled for the flashlight on the kitchen counter, his hands shaking, not from cold, but from something deeper. The beam revealed everything exactly as it had been. His sister's homework scattered across the table, his mother's reading glasses perched on the arm of her chair, his father's boots by the door. Except the people were gone. Ethan pulled on his jacket and stepped onto the porch. The snow was already ankle-deep and showed no signs of stopping. In the pale light filtering through the storm clouds, he could see tracks leading away from the cabin. Multiple sets, all heading toward the forest. But something was wrong with them. They weren't the measured steps of people choosing their direction. They wandered, looped back on themselves, then veered sharply toward the tree line as if pulled by an invisible force. "This doesn't make sense," he whispered, following the tracks until they disappeared into the dark wall of pine and oak. He called out again, his voice swallowed by the trees. Only the echo came back, hollow and mocking. His phone showed no signal. It hadn't since they'd arrived 3 days ago. The landline was dead too, probably taken out by the storm. Ethan's chest tightened as the reality of his situation began to sink in. The nearest neighbor was 12 miles down a mountain road that would be impassable until the storm cleared. And from the looks of the sky, that wouldn't be any time soon. Back inside, he tried to think rationally. His father always said to assess the situation before taking action. Food first, they'd brought enough supplies for a week, maybe 10 days if he stretched it. Water wouldn't be a problem with the well and all this snow. Heat was critical. Without the generator, he'd have to rely on the fireplace. But as Ethan moved through these practical considerations, his mind kept circling back to those tracks. His family hadn't just decided to take a midnight stroll in a blizzard. Something had happened, something impossible. He found himself standing in front of his grandfather's old trunk in the corner of the main room. Ethan had always avoided it, partly because it reminded him too much of the gruff old man who died when Ethan was 12, and partly because opening it felt like admitting defeat, acknowledging that the comfortable, connected world he knew might not always be there to catch him. The brass clasps were stiff with age, but they opened with sharp clicks that seemed unnaturally loud in the empty cabin. Inside, beneath layers of moth-eaten wool and the smell of cedar and old tobacco, Ethan found his grandfather's journals. Dozens of them, leather-bound and filled with dense handwriting that documented decades of life in these mountains. He pulled out the top journal and opened it at random. The entry was dated 15 years earlier, written in his grandfather's careful script. Temperature dropped to 18 below last night. Lost power for 4 days. Had to show Margaret how to bank a fire properly. City folk never learn to think past the next hour. The mountain doesn't care about your plans. Ethan flipped through more pages, finding detailed notes about everything from building deadfall traps to identifying edible plants to reading weather patterns in the behavior of animals. His grandfather had lived through the kind of isolation that would kill most people, and he'd documented every hard-learned lesson. Another entry caught his eye. Strange things happen in these mountains when the storms get bad enough. Folks go missing, turn up later with no memory of where they've been. The old Cherokee stories talk about it, but most people don't want to hear about things they can't explain. The important thing is survival. Take care of yourself first, worry about the mysteries later. Ethan's hands stilled on the page. His grandfather had known about people disappearing, had maybe even seen it happen before. Outside, the wind was picking up again, driving the snow against the windows with increasing force. The weather radio crackled to life long enough to warn of whiteout conditions for the next several days. All roads were closed, no one would be coming to check on them. Ethan looked around the cabin that had been a vacation retreat just hours ago. Now it was something else entirely, a fortress, a prison, a test he'd never asked to take. He thought of his family somewhere out there in the storm, and the impossibility of their situation made his throat tight with panic. But panic was a luxury he couldn't afford. His grandfather's voice echoed in his memory, rough with decades of cigarettes and hard living. The mountain doesn't care about your plans, boy. It only respects what you can do. The silence that followed his family's disappearance felt like a living thing, pressing against Ethan's eardrums until he thought they might burst. He sat on the cabin floor for what felt like hours, staring at the door they'd walked through, waiting for them to return with some reasonable explanation. Maybe they'd found better shelter. Maybe they were gathering firewood. Maybe they were coming back any second, with Dad's booming laugh echoing across the snow. But the storm had passed, leaving behind a crystalline world of white that stretched endlessly in every direction, and still they didn't come. When hunger finally drove him to move, Ethan's legs had gone numb. He stumbled to the small pile of supplies his family had managed to salvage from their overturned car, a half-empty box of granola bars, 3 bottles of water, a first aid kit, and his mother's purse with her emergency cash that seemed utterly useless now. The sight of it all, so pitifully small, so inadequate, made his chest tighten with something between panic and rage. He needed to think. Grandpa Joe's voice echoed in his memory, rough and patient from those long-ago summer visits. Boy, when you're in trouble, you don't run around like a chicken with its head cut off. You sit, you think, you make a plan. Ethan forced himself to take inventory of everything he had, both material and mental. The cabin itself was sturdy enough, though drafty. Someone had left behind a few rusted tools in one corner, an old axe with a loose handle, a dented pot, and what looked like fishing line wound around a piece of wood. More importantly, he had the things Grandpa Joe had taught him during those summers that had seemed so boring at the time. Fire is life, his grandfather had said, showing him how to coax flames from damp kindling. You can live without food for weeks, without water for days, but in weather like this, you'll die without heat in hours. The cabin had a stone fireplace, though it hadn't been used in years. Ethan spent his first real day of solitude clearing out old debris and bird nests, grateful for any task that kept his hands busy and his mind away from the growing certainty that something terrible had happened to his family. He found dry wood stacked against the cabin's back wall, protected from the storm by an overhang. Getting the fire started took him 6 attempts. His fingers were clumsy with cold and fear, and he'd forgotten half of what Grandpa Joe had shown him about arranging tinder and kindling. When the flames finally caught, dancing orange and gold in the stone hearth, Ethan felt something loosen in his chest for the first time since waking up alone. The warmth changed everything. With heat came clarity, and with clarity came the brutal mathematics of survival. 3 water bottles wouldn't last long. The granola bars might stretch to a week if he was careful. After that, he'd have to find food or starve. The nearest town was at least 30 miles through mountain terrain that would be treacherous even in good weather. In winter, with snow covering every trail marker and familiar landmark, it might as well have been on the moon. But there were other things Grandpa Joe had taught him. How to find water by following the lay of the land. How to identify which plants stayed edible through winter. How to set snares for small game, though Ethan's stomach turned at the thought of killing anything, even to save his own life. "The mountain provides," his grandfather used to say, "but only if you know how to ask." As night fell on his second day alone, Ethan sat by the fire and tried to remember everything. He thought about the way Grandpa Joe could read weather in the color of the sky, find direction from the growth patterns of moss on trees, and locate underground springs by the way certain grasses grew. Skills that had seemed like party tricks when he was 10 now felt like the difference between life and death. Sleep came in fragments, broken by every sound the wind made as it moved through the pines outside. Each time he woke, Ethan's first thought was that his family had returned, that he'd hear his father's voice calling his name, but there was only the whisper of snow settling and the pop and hiss of dying embers in the fireplace. On the third morning, he made a decision that felt both terrifying and inevitable. He couldn't wait for rescue that might never come. He couldn't survive on hope and 3 granola bars. If his family was coming back, they'd find him here when they did. If they weren't, and the cold voice in his head that sounded disturbingly like Grandpa Joe insisted they weren't, then he had to save himself. The old man had always said that survival wasn't about being strong or smart or lucky. It was about being stubborn enough to keep breathing when everything else told you to quit. Ethan fed the fire, pulled on his jacket, and stepped outside to begin learning how to live. The morning brought silence so complete it felt like death itself. Ethan woke to find frost coating the inside of his makeshift shelter, his breath forming white clouds that dissipated quickly in the bitter air. His stomach cramped with hunger, a gnawing reminder that yesterday's handful of pine nuts wouldn't sustain him much longer. He crawled from beneath the tarp, his joints stiff and protesting. The snow had stopped falling, but the world remained blanketed in white that stretched endlessly in every direction. The storm had erased all familiar landmarks, transforming the forest into an alien landscape where every tree looked identical and every shadow could hide danger. Ethan's grandfather's voice echoed in his memory. First rule of survival, boy, water, shelter, fire, food, in that order. Always in that order. He'd found water in the form of snow he could melt. His shelter had kept him alive through the night, barely. The fire had died to cold ashes. That left food, and his stomach reminded him urgently of its importance. He forced himself to think systematically, the way Grandfather had taught him during those long summer afternoons when he'd rather have been playing video games. What could he eat in winter? What would still be available after the storm? Pine nuts if he could find more cones. Inner bark from certain trees, birch, willow, pine. Rose hips, if any remained on the bushes, maybe acorns buried under the snow. The thought of acorns sparked a memory. There had been a massive oak tree near their cabin, its base always littered with nuts in the fall. If he could find it, if he could dig through the snow. But first, fire. His fingers were already going numb, and the grey sky promised more snow before noon. He gathered dry bark from the underside of a fallen log, his movements clumsy in the cold. The matches were precious. He had maybe 20 left from his backpack. Each one had to count. The bark caught on his third attempt, and he nursed the tiny flame with pine needles and twigs until he had a respectable blaze. The heat felt like salvation against his face, but he knew it was temporary. He needed to keep moving, needed to find food before his strength failed entirely. Following what he hoped was the right direction, Ethan trudged through knee-deep snow toward where he remembered the oak tree standing. Each step was an effort that left him breathing hard in the thin, cold air. Sweat formed under his jacket, and he forced himself to unzip it despite the cold. Grandfather's voice again. Sweat is death in winter. Stay dry, stay warm, stay alive. When he finally found the oak, its massive trunk rising like a monument from the white expanse, relief flooded through him. He dropped to his knees and began digging with his hands, then with a flat piece of bark when his fingers became too numb to continue. 6 inches down, 8 inches, a foot, and then his makeshift tool struck something hard. Acorns, dozens of them, preserved under the snow like nature's own refrigerator. He gathered them into his jacket, his hands shaking with cold and excitement. They would need processing. Acorns were bitter with tannins that could make him sick, but he remembered the technique. Grandfather had shown him how to leach them, grinding the nuts and running water through them until the bitterness washed away. The wind picked up as he made his way back to his shelter, carrying with it the promise of more snow. His fire had burned low, and he quickly fed it more wood before settling down to process his find. Using a flat rock as an anvil and a smaller stone as a hammer, he began crushing the acorns. The work warmed his hands and gave him purpose beyond mere survival. As he worked, his mind began to clear. The panic of the first night was fading, replaced by something harder and more focused. He was alone, yes. His family was gone, lost somewhere in this wilderness or worse. But he was alive, and while he lived, there was still hope. The snow began falling again as afternoon faded toward evening, but Ethan felt a strange sense of accomplishment. He had fire, he had food, bitter and unpalatable, but food nonetheless. He had shelter, and he had learned something important about himself in the past 24 hours. He could survive this, not just endure it, but actively fight against it. Every small victory, the fire, the acorns, the simple fact that he was still breathing, was a declaration of defiance against the mountain's attempt to claim him. The wind howled outside his shelter as darkness fell, but Ethan no longer felt like the same terrified boy who had huddled here the night before. Something was changing inside him, hardening like steel in a forge. The mountain had taken his family, but it would not take him, not without the fight of his life. The cold bit deeper into the cabin as Ethan woke on his 7th day alone. Ice had formed on the inside of the windows overnight, creating crystalline patterns that would have been beautiful under different circumstances. His breath came out in visible puffs as he rolled out of the makeshift bed he'd constructed from couch cushions and every blanket he could find. The fire had died to barely glowing embers. Again. Ethan's hands shook as he fed kindling to the weak flames, watching desperately as they caught and grew. He'd become obsessed with the fire, checking it every few hours throughout the night. Without it, he knew he'd freeze to death in his sleep. His stomach cramped with hunger. The cereal and crackers were gone. Yesterday, he'd found a can of tomato soup in the back of a cupboard, but even rationing it carefully, it had only lasted 2 meals. Now, as he opened every cabinet and drawer for the 3rd time, the reality hit him like a physical blow. There was no more food. His grandfather's voice echoed in his memory. The mountain provides, but only if you know how to ask. Ethan pulled on his father's heavy coat and stepped outside into the biting wind. The snow had finally stopped, but it lay 3 feet deep across the landscape, transforming the familiar terrain into an alien world. He couldn't even see the path that led down to the main road. His first attempt at finding food was pathetic. He wandered around the cabin's perimeter, kicking at the snow, hoping to uncover something edible. After an hour, his feet were numb, and he'd found nothing but rocks and frozen dirt. Back inside, he sat by the fire and tried to remember everything his grandfather had taught him during those long summer visits. There had been lessons about edible plants, about reading animal signs, about setting simple snares. At the time, Ethan had been more interested in his phone or getting back to his friends in the city. Now, those half-remembered lessons might be the difference between life and death. He spent the afternoon searching through his grandfather's belongings more systematically. In a wooden chest beneath his grandfather's bed, he found treasures, a hand-drawn journal filled with sketches of local plants and animals, notes about seasonal patterns, and detailed instructions for wilderness survival techniques. The journal's pages were yellowed and brittle, but the information was gold. His grandfather had documented everything: which mushrooms were safe to eat, how to identify rabbit tracks, where to find winter-hardy plants that might still have edible roots beneath the snow. One page stopped him cold. It was titled Emergency Winter Food Sources and included a detailed drawing of something called inner bark bread, made from certain trees. Below that, instructions for making simple snares from wire and string. Ethan looked up from the journal toward the window. The sun was already getting low, casting long blue shadows across the snow. He'd lost another day to hunger and hesitation. That evening, working by lamplight, he began making his first snare using picture wire he'd found in a drawer and techniques described in the journal. His fingers were clumsy, and he had to start over several times, but eventually he had something that looked similar to the diagram. The next morning he ventured out earlier, carrying the snare and a small shovel he'd found in the shed. Following the journal's advice, he looked for rabbit tracks in the snow. It took him over an hour of searching before he found what might have been the right kind of prints. Small, elongated ovals leading from a cluster of bare shrubs toward a fallen log. Setting the snare felt wrong, almost cruel. But, as his stomach cramped again with hunger, Ethan forced himself to place it carefully along what appeared to be a regular path, securing it exactly as the journal instructed. He spent the rest of the day learning to identify trees by their bark patterns, searching for the birch trees his grandfather had written about. When he finally found one, he used his father's hunting knife to carefully peel away strips of the outer bark, revealing the pale inner layer beneath. The inner bark was fibrous and bitter, but the journal promised it contained nutrients that could keep him alive. He chewed it slowly, trying not to gag at the texture and taste. It wasn't food in any sense he understood, but it was something to put in his empty stomach. That night, as wind howled around the cabin and the fire crackled in the hearth, Ethan studied the journal by lamplight. Each page revealed how much his grandfather had known about this place, how deeply connected he'd been to the rhythms of the mountain. For the first time since his family had vanished, Ethan felt something other than despair. It wasn't hope exactly, but it was determination. His grandfather had survived here for decades. The mountain had provided for him. Maybe, if Ethan could remember enough, if he could learn quickly enough, it would provide for him too. The axe felt heavier with each swing, but Ethan forced himself to maintain the rhythm Grandpa Joe had taught him years ago. Sharp crack, pull back, adjust angle, swing again. The oak grounds split reluctantly in the bitter morning air, each piece adding to the growing pile beside his shelter. 27 days alone now. He'd started keeping count by carving notches into a birch tree near the lean-to, though some mornings he wondered if he'd missed a day or counted twice. Time moved differently when every moment was consumed by the simple act of staying alive. His stomach cramped with familiar hunger. The rabbit snares had been empty for 3 days running, and his improvised fishing through the ice had yielded nothing but frozen fingers. The emergency rations from the cabin were long gone, stretched far beyond their intended limits. Now it was just him against the mountain's indifference. Armed with whatever skills he could scrape together from half-remembered lessons and desperate innovation. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of snow. Ethan paused mid-swing and studied the sky through the bare branches. Grey clouds gathered along the ridgeline, thick and promising. Another storm, maybe bigger than the last one that had nearly collapsed his shelter, under 2 feet of wet snow. He needed food before the weather turned. Real food, not just the bitter inner bark he'd been choking down or the handful of rose hips he'd managed to harvest from thorny bushes. Movement caught his eye across the small clearing. A flash of brown between the trees, too large for a squirrel, too quick for a deer. Ethan froze, axe raised, every sense suddenly sharp. For a moment, the forest held its breath. Then he saw them. 3 wild turkeys picking their way through the underbrush, their heads bobbing as they searched for food beneath the snow. Ethan's mouth watered involuntarily. One of those birds would feed him for a week if he could preserve the meat properly. Moving with excruciating slowness, he set down the axe and reached for the makeshift sling he'd fashioned from strips of fabric torn from his jacket lining. Grandpa Joe had shown him how to use one during a camping trip when Ethan was 12, though he'd never managed to hit anything larger than a tree trunk. His fingers were clumsy with cold as he selected a smooth stone from his collection. The turkeys were maybe 30 feet away, still unaware of his presence. He'd get one chance before they scattered. Ethan slipped the stone into the sling's pouch and began the slow rotation. building momentum while trying to keep his movements minimal. The leather whispered through the air. One of the turkeys raised its head, alert but not yet alarmed. Faster now, the sling humming with increasing speed. Ethan picked his target, the largest bird, slightly separated from the others. His grandfather's voice echoed in his memory. "Don't aim where it is, aim where it's going to be." The turkey took a step forward, head down again. Ethan released one end of the sling. The stone flew wild, striking a tree trunk with a sharp crack. All three birds erupted into motion, wings thrashing as they launched themselves into the air with surprising grace for such heavy creatures. Within seconds, they disappeared into the forest canopy, leaving only scattered feathers and the echo of Ethan's frustrated curse. He slumped against a tree, the sling hanging limp in his hands. The missed opportunity felt like a physical blow. Those turkeys represented warmth, strength, the difference between surviving and thriving. Now they were gone, and who knew when he'd see them again? The snow began to fall as predicted, fat flakes drifting down through the skeletal branches. Ethan forced himself to move, gathering his split wood and securing it under the tarp extension he'd added to his shelter. The work warmed his muscles but did nothing for the hollow ache in his belly. As the storm intensified, he huddled inside the lean-to and tried to remember everything Grandpa Joe had taught him about winter hunting. "Patience," his grandfather had always said. "The mountain provides, but only for those who understand its rhythms." Ethan pulled out his knife and began shaping another stone for the sling, then another. His fingers worked automatically while his mind replayed the failed shot, analyzing what went wrong. The release was off, his stance uncertain, but he was learning, adapting. Each failure taught him something new about survival, about himself. Outside, the wind howled through the trees and snow piled against the shelter walls. But inside, warmed by his small fire and focused on the work in his hands, Ethan felt something he hadn't experienced since the day his family vanished. Determination edged with hope. The turkeys would return, and when they did, he'd be ready. He carved another notch into his counting stick and settled in to wait out the storm. The morning brought no rescue helicopters, no distant shouts of search teams, no salvation. Only the endless white silence that had become Ethan's world. He lay in his shelter, listening to his stomach gnaw at itself, counting the days since his last real meal. 7, 8. The numbers blurred together like everything else. His water supply had frozen solid overnight despite keeping the containers close to his body. The fire had died to cold ash while he slept, and now ice crystals formed with each breath he exhaled. The sleeping bag that had seemed adequate at home felt thin as paper against the mountain's fury. Ethan forced himself to sit up, his joints protesting with sharp pains. Through the shelter's entrance, he could see the storm had finally passed, leaving behind a landscape so transformed it might have been another planet. Snow had drifted against trees until they looked like white monuments. The world lay buried under at least 3 feet of powder. But something had changed in him during the night. The panic that had clawed at his chest for days had crystallized into something harder, more focused. His grandfather's voice seemed clearer now, cutting through the fog of desperation. "First thing you do when you're truly lost," Grandpa Joe had told him years ago while they tracked deer through these same mountains, "is admit you're lost. Stop fighting it, accept it. Then you can start thinking straight." Ethan crawled from the shelter and stood in the knee-deep snow. The cold bit through his jacket immediately, but he didn't retreat. Instead, he looked around with new eyes, not the eyes of a scared kid waiting to be rescued, but the eyes of someone who had to survive. The creek he'd been following had disappeared under the snow, but he could trace its path by the depression in the white surface. Water meant life, and water would eventually lead to civilization. But not if he died of starvation first. He needed food, and waiting for rescue wasn't a food procurement strategy. His grandfather had shown him rabbit runs years ago, the trails they made through brush and undergrowth, worn smooth by countless passages. Under the snow, those runs would still exist. Rabbits had to eat too, which meant they'd dig down to vegetation, creating holes and disturbances in the snow. Ethan began moving through the forest methodically, reading the landscape like a book written in white ink. There, a small depression with scattered tracks around it, and there, barely visible scratches in the snow near a stand of young aspens where rabbits would strip bark when other food was scarce. He spent the morning crafting snares from the thin wire he'd salvaged from his father's emergency kit. His fingers, clumsy with cold, struggled with the delicate work. 3 times he had to restart when the wire kinked wrong, but Grandpa Joe's hand seemed to guide his own, showing him how to create the simple slip noose that could mean the difference between eating and starving. The first snare went at the base of a large oak where multiple tracks converged. The second near a fallen log that created a natural funnel. The third along what looked like a major highway in rabbit terms, a clear path between dense brush. Setting the snares felt like placing bets with death itself. If he was wrong about the locations, if the rabbits found other routes, if the wire snapped in the cold, he would grow weaker while his trap line produced nothing. But as he worked, other memories surfaced unbidden. Grandpa Joe teaching him to identify winter-active birds by their calls, showing him how to find rose hips and sumac berries that persisted through snow, explaining which inner bark could be eaten in desperate times. "The mountain provides," the old man had always said, "but it don't serve you dinner on a platter. You got to know how to ask politely." Ethan gathered what he could find. A handful of withered rose hips, some sumac clusters that still clung to bare branches. Not much, but enough to quiet his stomach's most urgent protests. He even stripped bark from a birch tree, remembering how his grandfather had made him taste the wintergreen flavor of the inner layer. "Calories," he said aloud, his voice strange in the vast silence. "Everything's about calories now." By afternoon, he'd checked his snares twice with no luck. Disappointed but not defeated, he focused on his shelter. The thin walls that had barely protected him the night before needed serious reinforcement. Using fallen branches and packed snow, he created a more substantial windbreak. He gathered dry wood from the undersides of fallen logs, building up his fuel supply. As darkness approached, he managed to coax a proper fire from his dwindling supply of matches. The flames danced against the white walls of his improved shelter, creating a small pocket of warmth and light in the vast cold wilderness. Tomorrow, he would check the snares again. Tomorrow, he would push further along the creek, looking for better shelter sites, for signs of the outside world, for any advantage in this deadly game he was playing against the mountain. Tonight, though, he was still alive, still thinking, still fighting, and that would have to be enough. The storm had been building for 3 days, and Ethan could taste the electricity in the air. His grandfather's voice echoed in his memory, "When the mountains go quiet, boy, you best listen. They're telling you something important." Everything had gone silent. No birds, no wind through the pines. Even the creek seemed to whisper instead of babble. Ethan stood outside his shelter, scanning the grey-black clouds rolling over the ridgeline like a massive wave about to break. This wasn't going to be another passing squall. He had maybe 6 hours. His body moved with practiced efficiency now, muscle memory carved by weeks of repetition. First, the firewood. He'd been stockpiling for days, but not enough for what was coming. The axe sang through seasoned oak and hickory, each swing precise and economical. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the dropping temperature. Stack by stack, he built his fortress of fuel against the shelter's north wall. The wood had to be bone dry and close enough to reach without exposing himself to the storm's fury. He'd learned that lesson during a 3-day blizzard 2 weeks ago when he'd nearly lost 2 toes to frostbite retrieving wet logs from an outside pile. The wind picked up, sending dead leaves skittering across the clearing like tiny ghosts fleeing the approaching darkness. Water came next. He dug a drainage channel around his shelter after the last big storm, but this time he reinforced it with rocks hauled up from the creek bed. The icy stones numbed his fingers, but he kept working. Water was patient and persistent. It would find any weakness and exploit it without mercy. Inside the shelter, He checked his supplies with the methodical focus of a ship's captain preparing for rough seas. Dried fish wrapped in birch bark. Acorn flour ground fine and stored in his salvaged coffee can. Wild onions and nuts cached in every corner. The rabbit he'd snared yesterday hung from the roof beam, already partially smoked. His stomach clenched with familiar hunger, but he ignored it. Food was fuel now, nothing more. He'd learned to separate the pleasure of eating from the necessity of survival. Every calorie had to count. The first fat snowflakes began to fall as he sealed the gaps in his shelter walls with fresh mud and pine needles. The mixture would freeze solid within hours, creating an airtight barrier against the wind. He'd made the mistake of leaving gaps during his first winter storm and had spent a miserable night fighting drafts that sapped his body heat. Thunder rumbled overhead, unusual for a snowstorm. This was going to be something special. Ethan ducked inside and began his final preparations. He arranged his bedding in layers, pine boughs on the bottom for insulation, then the salvaged sleeping bag, then every piece of clothing he owned, laid out within arm's reach. Body heat was precious currency, and he'd learned not to waste a single degree. The wind picked up, rattling the walls. Through the gaps he hadn't yet sealed, he could see the snow falling harder now, big wet flakes that would soon turn to ice as the temperature dropped. He thought about his family, as he did every night, but pushed the memories away. Grief was another kind of cold that could kill you if you let it in too deep. There would be time for mourning later, if he lived long enough. The storm hit like a freight train. One moment the wind was merely strong, the next it was a howling beast trying to tear his shelter apart board by board. Snow drove horizontally past his one small window, so thick he couldn't see 3 feet beyond the glass. Ethan fed the fire carefully, nursing it with strips of birch bark and dry kindling. The flames danced wildly as air pressure fluctuated, but held steady. Fire was life. Fire was hope. Fire was the thin orange line between survival and surrender. Hours passed. The storm's voice changed from a howl to a shriek to something that sounded almost like screaming. The walls groaned but held. His drainage system worked, channeling the melting snow away from his foundation. The mud and needle chinking kept the wind at bay. He ate sparingly, a handful of nuts, a strip of fish, and sipped water warmed by the fire. Outside, the world was being remade by wind and ice and snow, sculpted into new and deadly forms. But inside his small sanctuary, Ethan had created something that could endure. The realization hit him with startling clarity. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was thriving. The terrified boy who had stumbled through these mountains months ago was gone, replaced by someone harder, more focused, more alive in ways he'd never imagined possible. The storm raged on, but Ethan smiled in the firelight, finally understanding what his grandfather had been trying to teach him all along. The wilderness didn't want to kill him. It wanted to forge him into something stronger. The wind howled through the gaps in the shelter walls like a living thing desperate to get inside. Ethan pulled the rabbit fur blanket tighter around his shoulders, watching his breath form small clouds in the frigid air. Day 43. The storm had been raging for 3 days straight, and his food supplies were running dangerously low. He'd managed to trap 2 rabbits the week before, but the meat was already gone. The handful of dried berries he'd saved looked pitiful in the corner of his shelter, his stomach cramped with hunger, a sensation that had become as familiar as breathing. The fire crackled weakly, fed by the last of his seasoned wood. Beyond the orange glow, everything was darkness and cold. Ethan closed his eyes and tried to remember his grandfather's voice, searching for any forgotten wisdom that might help him survive until the storm passed. When the world turns against you, boy, you turn inward. Find what's strong inside you and hold on to it like a lifeline. Grandpa Joe's words came back to him as clearly as if the old man were sitting beside the fire. Ethan opened his eyes and stared at his hands, calloused now, scarred from countless cuts and burns, but capable in ways they'd never been before. These hands had built walls that kept out the killing cold. They'd woven snares that caught food. They'd sparked fire from nothing but friction and determination. The wind shifted, and snow began filtering through a crack near the roof. Ethan grabbed a piece of bark and wedged it into the gap, but more cold air found its way inside. He needed to do something about the shelter's weaknesses, storm or no storm. Working by firelight, he began methodically checking every joint, every wall, every possible entry point for the cold. He stuffed moss into cracks, repositioned logs that had shifted, and reinforced the areas where wind pressure was strongest. The work warmed him, and more importantly, it gave his mind something to focus on besides the gnawing hunger. As he worked, his fingers found the carved wooden figure in his pocket, the rabbit he'd whittled during his first week alone. The wood was smooth now from constant handling, a talisman that reminded him he was still human, still creative, still alive. A loud crack outside made him freeze, not the sound of breaking wood, but something else. Footsteps? His heart hammered as he strained to listen over the wind. Another crack, closer this time. Ethan grabbed the knife from his belt and moved toward the shelter entrance. He'd seen no signs of other people since his family disappeared, but he'd found old tracks in the forest, boot prints too large to be his father's. The thought of encountering a stranger out here, in his weakened state, terrified him. The sounds stopped. He waited, knife ready, every muscle tense. Minutes passed with only the storm's fury for company. Finally, he convinced himself it had been falling branches or shifting snow. Still, he didn't lower the knife for a long time. When he finally settled back by the fire, exhaustion hit him like a physical blow. The constant vigilance, the hunger, the cold, they were wearing him down in ways that went deeper than physical discomfort. Some nights, he caught himself talking to the fire, as if it were a person. Other times, he thought he heard voices in the wind calling his name. But tonight felt different. As he stared into the flames, Ethan realized something had changed inside him. The boy who'd panicked during the first snowstorm was gone, replaced by someone harder, more focused, someone who could hear potential threats in the darkness and respond with a weapon instead of fear. The change should have disturbed him, but instead it felt like putting on clothes that finally fit. This person he was becoming, this survivor, felt more real than the version of himself that had worried about algebra tests and social media posts just 2 months ago. He reached for his journal, a habit that had become sacred ritual. By flickering firelight, he wrote about the storm, the food shortage, the mysterious sounds outside. But as his pencil moved across the bark paper, other words began flowing. I used to think strength meant being the biggest or the loudest. Grandpa knew better. Real strength is quiet. It's fixing what's broken instead of complaining. It's staying calm when everything around you is chaos. It's choosing to keep going when stopping would be easier. The fire popped, sending sparks dancing toward the ceiling. Ethan set down his journal and added another piece of precious wood to the flames. Tomorrow, if the storm cleared, he'd need to venture out to hunt. The thought didn't fill him with dread anymore. It filled him with purpose. Outside, the wind began to ease slightly, though snow continued falling. Ethan wrapped himself in the rabbit fur blanket and settled against the wall to sleep. His last thought, before exhaustion claimed him, was a promise. He would not just survive this winter. He would emerge from it transformed into exactly who he was meant to be. The storm that had been building for 3 days finally unleashed its fury on the 4th morning of Ethan's 8th week alone. He woke to the violent shaking of his shelter as winds that sounded like freight trains tore through the mountain passes above. Snow drove horizontally past his small window, and the temperature inside his carefully insulated home dropped 20 degrees in the first hour. This wasn't like the previous storms. This was the kind of weather that killed people. Ethan pulled on every layer he owned, his breath forming clouds even inside the shelter. The fire in his stone hearth struggled against downdrafts that sent smoke billowing back into the room. He'd reinforced the chimney twice, but nature was testing every weakness in his construction. The wind found gaps he didn't know existed. It whistled through tiny spaces between logs, around the doorframe, and somehow through what he'd thought was a perfectly sealed roof. Within hours, snow began accumulating in the corners of his shelter despite his best efforts. By midday, he realized the door was frozen shut. Panic fluttered in his chest as he threw his shoulder against the thick wooden barrier he'd crafted so carefully weeks ago. The leather hinges held, but ice had sealed the edges completely. He was trapped in a space barely larger than his parents' walk-in closet, with a fire that was slowly losing its battle against the cold. Grandfather's voice echoed in his memory. "When you can't fight the mountain, you become part of it." Ethan forced himself to stop and think. He had food for several days, though his water was already starting to freeze despite being near the fire. The real danger wasn't immediate starvation. It was the cold creeping in through every imperfection in his shelter and the possibility that the storm might last longer than his firewood. He began methodically plugging every gap he could find, using strips of bark, pine needles, and even pieces of his spare clothing. The work kept his blood moving and his mind focused. As the hours passed, the shelter slowly began holding heat more effectively. The wind howled for 2 days without stopping. On the second night, lying in his sleeping furs with the fire burned down to embers, Ethan listened to a sound that made his heart race. Something heavy was moving outside his shelter. The footsteps were too large and deliberate to be deer, too close together to be elk, bear. He lay perfectly still, controlling his breathing as the animal circled his shelter. It paused at the door, snuffling loudly. Ethan could hear its claws scratching against the wood he'd spent so much time smoothing and fitting. The bear was curious about the strange wooden cave that smelled of human and smoke. For 20 minutes that felt like hours, the bear investigated every inch of his shelter's exterior. It pushed against the walls, solid logs that held firm. It tested the door, frozen in place by the storm. It even seemed to examine the chimney, though Ethan couldn't imagine what it made of the thin stream of smoke emerging into the blizzard. Finally, the footsteps moved away, but Ethan didn't sleep the rest of the night. He lay awake, understanding that his little sanctuary wasn't just protection from weather. It was all that stood between him and predators who were also struggling to survive this brutal winter. When the wind finally died on the third morning, the silence was almost deafening. Ethan used his knife and a piece of burning wood to melt the ice around his door, working carefully to avoid damaging the wood. When he finally pushed it open, he gasped. The world had been completely transformed. Snow reached nearly to his waist, and drifts climbed halfway up the sides of nearby trees. His carefully marked trails had vanished completely. The landscape looked alien, like he'd been transported to another planet while trapped in his shelter. But his snares, the few whose locations he could identify, had been productive. 3 rabbits hung frozen in the wire loops, gifts from animals who'd been as disoriented by the storm as he was. The discovery filled him with a surge of hope that surprised him with its intensity. More importantly, the bear tracks were clearly visible in the fresh snow, circling his shelter exactly as he'd imagined. But there were other tracks too, smaller paw prints that might have been fox or raccoon, and the delicate impressions of birds who'd somehow survived the storm. Life persisted. Life adapted. Life found a way. As Ethan began the careful work of digging out his shelter and re-establishing his trails, he realized something had shifted inside him during those 3 days of confinement. The desperate edge of his daily survival routine had been replaced by something calmer and more sustainable. He was no longer just surviving day by day. He was living here. The mountain had tested him with its worst, and his shelter had held. His preparations had been enough. For the first time since his family's disappearance, Ethan felt something that might have been confidence building in his chest. Winter still had months left to run, but he was ready for whatever came next. The ice storm arrived without warning on day 73, transforming Ethan's mountain sanctuary into a crystalline prison. He woke to the sound of branches snapping like gunshots, each crack echoing through the forest with the finality of bones breaking. Through the smoke hole of his shelter, he could see the world had become glass overnight. Every surface wore a thick coat of ice. The pine boughs drooped under the weight, some touching the ground in perfect frozen arcs. His carefully maintained trails had vanished beneath a mirror-smooth surface that reflected the grey sky in fractured patterns. Even the stream had surrendered to the ice, its familiar babble silenced beneath a crystal shell. Ethan's breath formed clouds as he surveyed the damage from his doorway. The rabbit snares he'd set yesterday were invisible now, buried somewhere in the transformed landscape. His woodpile had become a sculpture of ice-welded logs that would take precious energy to separate. Most concerning of all, the ice coating on the trees meant his usual foraging spots were completely inaccessible. He retreated into the shelter and fed the fire with some of his dwindling dry wood supply. The flames cast dancing shadows on the earthen walls as he took inventory of his situation. 3 days of dried meat remained, maybe 4 if he rationed carefully. A handful of acorn flour, some pine needle tea. It wasn't enough to wait out a major ice storm. The memory of his grandfather's voice drifted back to him. Ice storms are the mountain's way of testing who deserves to stay and who needs to leave. You don't fight ice, boy, you dance with it. By midday, when the ice showed no signs of melting, Ethan made his decision. He would have to venture out, not to hunt or forage in the usual sense, but to adapt to this new frozen world his mountain had become. He wrapped his feet in extra layers of bark and hide, creating makeshift ice grips. The bone knife went into his belt, along with the fire-starting kit sealed in birch bark. The first step outside nearly sent him sprawling. The ice was impossibly slick, turning every movement into a careful negotiation between balance and momentum. He moved like his grandfather had taught him to walk in swamps, testing each step, shifting weight gradually, never committing fully until he was certain of his footing. The forest had become a cathedral of ice, beautiful and deadly in equal measure. Icicles hung from every branch like frozen daggers, some thick as his arm and sharp enough to kill if they fell. The silence was absolute, broken only by his careful footsteps and the occasional distant crash of an overladen tree surrendering to gravity. He found the first opportunity near a massive oak that had partially toppled, its trunk now angled at 30 degrees. Ice had sealed its bark in a perfect clear coating, but where the trunk had scraped against another tree, the ice had cracked, revealing dark patches underneath. Ethan approached carefully and began chipping away with his knife. Beneath the ice, he found what he was looking for: beetle larvae, fat and white, hibernating in the bark crevices. The cold had made them sluggish, easy to harvest. He worked methodically, following each crack in the ice coating to expose more of the trunk's hidden protein stores. As the afternoon wore on, he developed a rhythm with the ice world. Near the frozen stream, he discovered that the ice had trapped air bubbles that created weak points. Careful pressure with a large stone broke through to the flowing water beneath. He drank deeply and filled his water container, sealing the hole afterward with mud and stones. The real treasure came when he found a section of hillside where the ice had formed a perfect slide. Recent winds had blown seeds and nuts down the slope before the freeze, and now they were preserved beneath the clear surface like insects in amber. He spent an hour carefully melting and chipping, harvesting enough calories to extend his supplies by several days. But it was the discovery at the old hemlock grove that truly shifted his perspective. The ice had weighted down the branches so severely that many trees had bent into natural lean-tos. More importantly, the spaces between the ice-sealed branches had created wind-proof pockets where small animals had taken shelter. He found them huddled in the ice caves, 3 squirrels, a raccoon, and several smaller rodents, all trapped but alive in the natural ice prisons. His grandfather's voice whispered again, "Sometimes the mountain gives you exactly what you need, just not in the way you expected." The ethical weight of the moment settled on him as he looked at the trapped creatures. This wasn't hunting in any traditional sense, but survival had taught him that sentimentality was a luxury he couldn't afford. The mountain had provided, and winter demanded he accept its harsh gifts. By evening he had returned to his shelter with enough food to last 2 weeks, and a profound new understanding of adaptation. The ice storm hadn't been an enemy to fight. It had been a teacher offering lessons in seeing opportunity within crisis. The morning brought an unsettling quiet that made Ethan's skin crawl. Even the wind had died, leaving the forest in an unnatural stillness that pressed against his eardrums like cotton. He'd learned to read the mountain's moods over these long weeks, and this silence felt wrong, predatory. He stood at the edge of his shelter, scanning the tree line with practiced eyes. The snow lay undisturbed except for the delicate tracks of a fox that had passed in the night. But something had changed. The usual chorus of winter birds was absent, and even the squirrels that normally chattered in the oak overhead were nowhere to be seen. Ethan's stomach clenched with more than hunger. Animals fled before storms, but this felt different, deeper. He pulled on his makeshift snowshoes, strips of hickory bent into teardrop shapes and woven with paracord from his grandfather's pack. The design had taken him 3 attempts to get right, but now they carried him across the snow's crust with barely a whisper. The trap line yielded nothing. Every snare sat empty, undisturbed. Even the rabbit runs he'd memorized showed no fresh sign. It was as if every living thing had simply vanished from this stretch of mountain. By midday, the silence had grown so complete that his own breathing sounded thunderous. Ethan found himself moving more carefully, though he couldn't say why. Some primal instinct whispered warnings that his rational mind couldn't decode. He was checking the deadfall trap near the frozen creek when he saw them. Tracks. But not from any animal he recognized. The prints were roughly human-sized but wrong in every detail that mattered. Too wide, too deep. The toe impressions suggested claws rather than nails, and the heel showed a pad-like structure that belonged to no boot he'd ever seen. Ethan crouched beside the clearest print, his breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. The track was fresh, so recent that the edges hadn't yet hardened in the cold. Whatever made it had passed this way within the hour. His grandfather's voice echoed from memory. "When you don't understand something in the wilderness, boy, you get still and you get smart. Don't run toward danger, but don't run from knowledge either." The tracks led upstream, following the creek bed with purposeful direction. Against every survival instinct screaming in his head, Ethan followed. The trail wound through a section of forest he'd avoided until now, a cluster of ancient hemlocks so thick they blocked most of the sky. Here, the snow lay thinner, filtered by the dense canopy above. The tracks became harder to follow, but other signs emerged. Scratches on tree bark, too high and too deep for a bear. Tufts of coarse, dark hair caught on low branches. A smell that made his nose wrinkle, musky and wild, but with an underlying sharpness that seemed almost metallic. Ethan's hand found the knife at his belt, though he knew the gesture was more comfort than protection. Whatever he was tracking had at least 50 pounds on him, possibly twice that. The creek bent sharply ahead, carving around a tumbled pile of granite boulders. As Ethan approached the bend, a new sound reached him, a low rumbling that vibrated through his chest rather than his ears. He froze. The sound came again, longer this time. Not quite growling, not quite breathing, something in between that raised every hair on his neck. Moving with excruciating care, Ethan eased forward until he could peer around the largest boulder. What he saw there would stay burned in his memory forever. A cave mouth yawned in the rocky hillside, partially hidden by fallen logs and overgrown rhododendron. But it wasn't the cave that stopped his breath. It was what emerged from it. The creature stood nearly 7 feet tall, covered in dark fur that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Its face was a nightmarish blend of human and animal features, intelligent eyes set in a skull that protruded too far forward, revealing teeth that belonged in no textbook he'd ever seen. When it turned in his direction, Ethan's heart stopped entirely. Those eyes found his with predatory precision. For one eternal moment, they stared at each other across 30 yards of winter forest, the boy who'd learned to survive and the thing that had never needed to learn. Then the creature took a step toward him. Ethan ran. He crashed through the underbrush with abandon, his snowshoes tangling in hidden vines and fallen branches. Behind him, he could hear pursuit, not the clumsy crashing he might expect from something so large, but a fluid, purposeful movement that spoke of perfect adaptation to this terrain. His shelter appeared ahead, and Ethan dove through the entrance, grabbing his grandfather's rifle with shaking hands. Only then did he realize the sounds of pursuit had stopped. Outside, the unnatural silence had returned. But now Ethan knew what had driven every other living thing from these woods. And he knew it had found him. The screech that split the dawn air wasn't human, but it carried a rage that made Ethan's blood freeze. He'd been checking his snares when the sound erupted from somewhere near his shelter, followed by the unmistakable crash of splintering wood. Bear. Ethan's mind went blank for a heartbeat before training kicked in. Granddad's voice echoed in his memory. Never run from a bear unless you're already somewhere safe. They're faster than you think. He forced himself to move slowly, deliberately back toward his camp. The destruction came into view gradually. His carefully constructed lean-to had been partially demolished, gear scattered across the snow like a child's abandoned toys. But it was the size of the tracks that made his knees weak. This wasn't the black bear he'd glimpsed weeks ago. These prints were massive, with claw marks extending 4 inches beyond the pads. The bear had found his food cache. 3 months of careful preservation, smoking and storage, gone. The underground pit he'd dug and lined with stones had been excavated with terrifying efficiency. Strips of venison, dried berries, nuts, even his backup supplies lay trampled and useless in the churned snow. Ethan sank to his knees, overwhelmed. The winter still had weeks to go, maybe a month if he was lucky. His body had already consumed most of its fat reserves, and now his primary food source was destroyed. The mathematical reality was brutal and simple. He was going to starve. The bear's scent lingered, musky, wild, territorial. It would likely return, especially if it associated this spot with food. Ethan couldn't stay here, but leaving meant abandoning his shelter, his fire pit, everything he'd built to survive. He stood slowly, forcing his mind to work past the panic. What would Granddad do? The answer came immediately: adapt. The mountains don't care about your plans. First priority, salvage what he could. A few strips of meat were dirty but edible. Some nuts had scattered beyond the main destruction. His tools were intact. The bear had been interested in food, not his knife or hatchet. His fire kit remained safely stored in his jacket. Second priority, find shelter before dark. The temperature was dropping again, and sleeping exposed would kill him faster than hunger. Ethan worked methodically, stuffing salvageable items into his pack. The bear tracks led north up the ridge. Good. He'd head south toward the valley where he'd seen rabbits, maybe even find the creek he'd lost track of during the last snowfall. As he prepared to leave, something caught his eye. Carved into a tree near his ruined shelter, partially hidden by shadow, were marks he hadn't noticed before. Not natural scratches, deliberate cuts. His heart hammered as he approached. Letters, faded but unmistakable, MC plus RC 2019. His parents' initials. They'd been here. Ethan traced the carving with trembling fingers. The cuts were weathered but not ancient. This tree stood 50 yards from where he'd built his shelter. He'd walked past it dozens of times without seeing the marks. Below the initials, smaller letters, E, Cabin, Ridge North. A message. For him. The bear forgotten. Ethan stared at the carving until his eyes watered. They'd survived the storm. At least initially. They'd come looking for him. Found this spot somehow, left a sign. A cabin on the north ridge. But the bear tracks led north too. Ethan closed his eyes, calculating. He had maybe 4 hours of daylight. The ridge was steep, treacherous in winter. He could easily miss the cabin in failing light, and spending a night exposed on the mountainside would likely kill him. The smart play was to find immediate shelter, wait for better conditions. But they might be there, right now, waiting. He thought of his mother's laugh, his father's steady hands, the family dinner table that seemed like something from another lifetime. The smart choice warred with desperate hope, until hope won. Ethan shouldered his pack and started climbing. The ascent was brutal. Snow had drifted deeper on the north-facing slope, and his weakened body protested every step. Twice he had to rest, gasping in the thin air before continuing. The bear tracks paralleled his route for a while before disappearing into a stand of pines. As the light began failing, Ethan spotted it, a dark shape against the snow that was too regular to be natural. A structure, small, partially collapsed, but unmistakably human-made. He stumbled the last 100 yards, exhaustion and anticipation driving him forward. The cabin's door hung open, banging in the wind. No smoke rose from its chimney, no tracks led to or from its entrance except animal paths. Ethan called out anyway, "Mom? Dad?" Only echoes answered. The cabin was empty, abandoned long before his parents could have reached it, but they'd tried to lead him here for a reason. As darkness settled over the mountains, Ethan stepped inside, hoping that reason would be enough to keep him alive. The ice storm hit on day 87 without warning, turning the forest into a crystal cathedral that threatened to shatter at the slightest touch. Ethan woke to the sound of branches snapping like gunshots, each crack echoing through the hollow with the finality of breaking bones. His breath formed clouds in the cabin as he scrambled to check the fire, nearly dead, just glowing embers that had barely kept the space above freezing. Outside, the world had transformed overnight. Every surface wore a shell of ice so thick it distorted shapes into alien forms. The pine trees drooped under the weight, their branches touching the ground in crystalline arcs. Even the path he'd worn to the woodpile had vanished beneath a treacherous sheet of black ice. The wind picked up as morning progressed, turning the ice-laden branches into weapons. Ethan watched from his window as a massive oak limb crashed down exactly where he would have been walking to check his snares. The forest was actively trying to kill him now, and he couldn't leave the cabin safely until the ice began to melt. But the temperature wasn't rising. If anything, it was dropping. By noon, he realized the gravity of his situation. The ice was too thick to break through to reach his woodpile without risking a branch crushing his skull. His food stores were running dangerously low. He'd been planning to check his trap line and fish through the ice today. The small amount of firewood he'd kept inside would last maybe 12 hours if he was careful. Panic crept up his throat like bile. After everything he'd survived, everything he'd learned, was he going to freeze to death because of one freak storm? No. Grandpa's voice cut through the fear with crystalline clarity. When the mountain shows her teeth, you show yours right back. Ethan forced himself to think methodically. He couldn't get to the main woodpile, but there might be other options. The furniture. His bed frame was solid oak. The extra chair could burn for hours. He still had pine pitch he'd collected for waterproofing that would burn hot and long, and there was the emergency cache he'd prepared weeks ago, buried beneath the cabin's foundation. The crawl space under the cabin was a nightmare of frozen earth and spider webs, but he'd hidden supplies there for exactly this kind of situation. His fingers, already numb despite his mittens, felt along the rough stones until they found the oilcloth bundle. Inside, jerky, dried berries, a precious jar of rendered bear fat, and most importantly, a small bundle of fatwood splits that would catch fire even in a blizzard. Back inside, he rationed his remaining firewood carefully, burning just enough to keep from freezing while he dismantled the chair. Each piece of furniture felt like surrendering part of himself, but survival meant making hard choices. The chair legs would burn clean and hot. The seat, being pine, would go quickly but give good flame to ignite the denser oak. As darkness fell, the temperature plummeted further. Ice began forming on the inside of his windows despite the fire. Ethan wrapped himself in every layer he owned and fed the stove piece by piece, calculating burn time against available fuel. The mathematics of survival had become stark and unforgiving. The storm raged for 3 days. On the second night, he burned his extra boots. The leather gave off toxic smoke but generated heat. On the third day, he was down to table legs and contemplating whether the cabin's interior walls contained enough wood to keep him alive. His food was gone except for a handful of acorns and some pine needle tea. But something had changed in those 3 days of desperate resourcefulness. Each crisis forced him to dig deeper, to find solutions that would have seemed impossible weeks ago. When the chair ran out, he discovered that dried moss mixed with pine pitch created a slow-burning fuel. When his water froze solid, he learned to melt ice with heated stones to conserve firewood. By the time the ice began to crack and fall in thunderous cascades, Ethan had stripped his shelter down to its essence and rebuilt it around pure function. The cabin looked different, spare, efficient, purposeful, like him. When he finally emerged into the post-storm world, everything glittered with deadly beauty. Broken branches lay everywhere like the bones of some massive creature. But the path to his woodpile was clear, and more importantly, he'd discovered something profound about his own capabilities. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was adapting, evolving, becoming something harder and more resilient than the boy who'd stumbled into these mountains 3 months ago. The ice storm had tried to break him, but instead it had burned away everything unnecessary, leaving only what was absolutely essential. As he rebuilt his fire with proper seasoned wood and surveyed the storm damage, Ethan realized he wasn't counting days until rescue anymore. He was simply living, moment by moment, challenge by challenge, becoming exactly what this wilderness demanded. The mountain had shown her teeth, and he'd shown his right back. The smoke spiral rising from his chimney had become as natural as breathing, but this morning it carried a different weight. Ethan stood at his cabin door watching the grey ribbon dissolve into the pewter sky and felt the approaching end like a physical presence. 3 weeks, maybe less. The thought should have filled him with relief, but instead it sat heavy in his chest like undigested food. He'd been counting days since the beginning, scratching marks into the doorframe with religious precision, but now those marks seemed to mock him. What exactly was he counting toward? His hands moved automatically through the morning routine, banking the fire, checking his water supply, inventorying the dried meat hanging from the rafters. The cabin hummed with quiet efficiency around him, every corner serving a purpose he'd carved from necessity and solitude. The walls he'd chinked and reknicked through the darkest months stood solid against the February wind. The root cellar he'd dug with bleeding hands still kept his remaining stores fresh. Everything worked because he'd made it work. But for how much longer? The question had been gnawing at him for days, not whether he could survive until spring. He'd already proven that to himself and to the mountain. The real question lurked deeper. What happened when the snow melted and the world came looking for him? Ethan pulled on his snowshoes and stepped into the morning light. The sun felt different now, carrying actual warmth instead of just the promise of it. In sheltered spots, he could see dark patches where the snow had begun its retreat. Soon the forestry roads would be passable again. Soon the search teams would return with their helicopters and their questions and their gentle, persistent voices, telling him it was time to come home. Home. The word felt foreign now, like a language half forgotten. He made his way to the creek, following the path his feet had worn, through 3 months of careful navigation. The ice remained solid, but he could hear the water moving beneath it. Quick, urgent whispers that spoke of spring's inevitability. By the bank he knelt and pressed his ear to the frozen surface, listening to the secret conversations flowing below. This was what he would miss most, he realized. Not the dramatic moments of survival, the blizzard nights when death breathed against his window, the successful hunts that meant another week of life. Those memories would stay sharp and clean. But this quiet intimacy with the mountain's daily rhythms, the way he'd learned to read weather in the color of dawn light, to predict wind changes by the way snow shifted off pine boughs. These subtleties would fade once he returned to a world of weather apps and climate control. The sound of breaking branches snapped him back to alertness. 50 yards downstream, a black bear emerged from the tree line, moving with the careful deliberation of hunger. Ethan remained motionless, watching the animal's progress along the creek bank. In his first weeks, such an encounter would have sent him scrambling for shelter. Now he simply observed, noting the bear's lean condition, the way it tested the ice with tentative pause. They were both survivors of the same winter, he and this bear. Both had learned to take only what they needed, to waste nothing, to read the mountain's moods like a beloved book. The difference was that come spring, the bear would continue its ancient dance with these peaks, while Ethan would be loaded into a vehicle and driven back to a world that suddenly seemed impossibly loud and rushed. The bear caught his scent and looked up, dark eyes meeting his across the distance. For a long moment they regarded each other, two creatures who understood the weight of solitude, the price of endurance. Then the bear huffed once and turned away, disappearing into the timber with surprising grace for something so massive. Ethan remained by the creek long after the bear had gone, watching meltwater drip steadily from an overhanging rock formation. Each drop caught the light before falling, and he found himself counting them without meaning to. 107, 108, always counting, always measuring time as if it were another resource to be carefully managed and rationed. But time wasn't his to control anymore. Spring would come whether he was ready or not. The search teams would return whether he wanted them or not. And he would have to make a choice that 3 months ago would have seemed absurd, whether to be found or to disappear deeper into the mountains, to become one of those legends that hikers whispered about around campfires. The dripping continued, marking moments he couldn't hold on to. Somewhere in the distance, a woodpecker drummed against dead timber, and the sound echoed off the canyon walls like Morse code messages he couldn't decode. The mountain was trying to tell him something, but he wasn't sure he was ready to listen. Not yet. But soon. The rescue helicopter's rotors beat against the morning air like a mechanical heartbeat, growing louder with each passing second. Ethan crouched beside his shelter, watching the orange and white aircraft circle overhead, its searchlight cutting through the forest canopy even in daylight. His hands trembled, not from cold this time, but from something he couldn't name. After 93 days of silence, the sound of civilization felt like an assault. The helicopter found a clearing 200 yards east of his camp and began its descent. Ethan stood slowly, his body protesting after months of careful, deliberate movement. He looked back at his domain, the intricate shelter system, the smokehouse with its remaining stores of meat, the ice fishing holes he'd maintained through sheer will, everything that had kept him alive, everything he was about to leave behind. He gathered the few items that mattered: his grandfather's knife, the journal where he'd documented each day's survival, and a small carving he'd made from pine, a rough approximation of his family, standing together. The rest would remain, a testament to what desperation and determination could build. The walk to the clearing felt both endless and far too short. Each step carried him further from the person he'd become and closer to the person everyone expected him to still be. But that 16-year-old boy who'd cowered in a cave during the first blizzard was gone, buried somewhere beneath layers of hard-won knowledge and necessary callousness. Two figures emerged from the helicopter as he approached, a paramedic in orange gear and a park ranger he recognized as Tom Brennan, who'd worked these mountains longer than Ethan had been alive. Their faces showed relief mixed with disbelief as they took in his appearance. "Jesus Christ, son," Brennan called out over the rotor noise. "We've been looking for you since October." Ethan nodded, but didn't speak immediately. Words felt foreign after weeks of talking only to himself and the mountain. The paramedic rushed forward with a thermal blanket, but Ethan stepped back instinctively, his body rejecting the offered help. "I'm fine," he said, and was surprised by how rough his voice sounded. "I don't need—" "You need medical attention," the paramedic interrupted, professional concern overriding politeness. 3 months alone in these conditions. We need to check for hypothermia, malnutrition, psychological trauma. Psychological trauma. As if surviving was the thing that damaged you, rather than the thing that revealed what you were truly capable of. Brennan studied Ethan's face with the careful attention of someone who'd spent decades reading the mountains and the people who challenged them. "Your family," he said gently. "We found them in November. The avalanche. I know. Ethan's voice cut through the explanation like his knife through sinew. I buried them. The two men exchanged glances. The paramedic's expression shifted from professional efficiency to something softer, more human. Son, you've been through something no one should have to endure. But you're safe now. We're going to take you home. Home. The word felt meaningless. Home had been a concept from before, when survival meant getting good grades and remembering to take out the trash. Now home was wherever he could build shelter and find water and convince his body to last another day. Where? He asked. Your Aunt Sarah in Tennessee. She's been coordinating the search efforts, waiting for them to find my body. Brennan's weathered face creased into something that might have been admiration. For them to find you alive. She never stopped believing. The helicopter pilot gestured impatiently from the cockpit, pointing to the sky where new clouds were gathering. Another storm system moving in, because the mountains never stopped testing you, never gave you more than brief windows of mercy. Ethan allowed himself to be guided toward the aircraft, but stopped at its threshold. He turned back toward his camp, invisible now through the trees, and felt something tear inside his chest. Not grief. He'd worked through that in the long nights by his fire. This was different. This was the pain of leaving behind the only version of himself that had ever been truly tested and found adequate. The shelter, he said suddenly. Someone should document it. What I built. Brennan nodded slowly. We will. The Park Service. We'll want to understand how you survived. What you learned out there. As the helicopter lifted off, Ethan pressed his face to the window and watched his domain shrink below him. The mountain spread out in all directions, vast and indifferent and beautiful in its cruelty. He'd thought he was conquering it, but now he understood the truth. It had been shaping him, carving away everything unnecessary until only the essential remained. The boy who'd entered these mountains was gone. The question that haunted him as they flew toward civilization was simpler and more terrifying than anything he'd faced in the wilderness. Who was he supposed to be now? The sound of helicopter rotors cut through the morning air like a mechanical heartbeat, growing louder with each passing second. Ethan stood frozen at the edge of his carefully constructed homestead, watching the orange and white aircraft circle overhead like some impossible dream made manifest. For 97 days, he had been the only human voice in this wilderness. Now, as the helicopter descended toward the clearing he'd burned months ago for his signal fire, the reality of rescue felt as terrifying as it did miraculous. The downdraft from the rotors sent snow swirling in violent spirals, and Ethan instinctively stepped back to protect the fire that had become his lifeline. 3 figures emerged from the aircraft, 2 paramedics in bright jackets, and a man in a ranger's uniform who moved with the careful efficiency of someone accustomed to mountain rescues. "Ethan Morrison?" the ranger called out, his voice barely audible over the engine noise. Ethan nodded, suddenly aware of how he must look. His clothes were a patchwork of repairs, his hair long and wild, his face weathered beyond his 16 years. When he tried to speak, his voice came out as a croak. He cleared his throat and tried again. "Yes, sir." The ranger approached slowly, his eyes taking in the sophisticated shelter, the organized firewood, the rabbit snares visible in the tree line. "Son, we've been looking for you for 3 months. Are you injured?" No. The word felt strange on his tongue. When had he last spoken to another person? "I'm okay." One of the paramedics began unpacking equipment, but the ranger held up a hand. "Ethan, where are your parents? Your sister?" The question he'd been dreading hit him like a physical blow. For 97 days, survival had been everything. Food, fire, shelter, water, the simple mechanics of staying alive had pushed the deeper questions into a place where they couldn't destroy him. Now, faced with this man's concerned expression, the full weight of his loss threatened to crush him. "Gone." His voice was barely a whisper. "The storm, the car went off the road. I tried to find them, but—" He gestured helplessly at the vast wilderness surrounding them. The ranger's expression softened. "We found the vehicle, son, at the bottom of Miller's Gorge. I'm sorry." Ethan felt his knees buckle, but somehow remained standing. He'd known deep in his bones, but hearing it confirmed was different. Final. "How did you survive out here?" the paramedic asked, genuine wonder in his voice as he looked around the camp. "This is incredible work. My grandfather, Ethan, managed. He taught me things when I was little. I just remembered." What he didn't say was how those memories had come back in fragments, usually when he needed them most. Old Tom's voice guiding him through the construction of deadfall traps, showing him which plants were edible, teaching him to read the sky for weather. The man who had died when Ethan was 12 had somehow become his salvation. "We need to get you to a hospital," the ranger said gently. "Get you checked out. Contact your family." Family. The word felt foreign now. Aunt Sarah in Ohio, who he'd met twice at Christmas dinners. Uncle Mike in California, who sent birthday cards with $20 bills. People who were blood but strangers, who would look at him with pity and try to understand something that couldn't be explained. "Can I?" Ethan looked back at his shelter, at the careful arrangements that had kept him alive. "Can I pack some things?" "Of course." He moved through the camp methodically, gathering items that had become precious beyond measure. His grandfather's knife, honed to razor sharpness on creek stones, the bow he'd crafted from hickory, though he doubted he'd ever need it again, a small notebook where he'd recorded weather patterns and animal behaviors written in charcoal on birch bark. The paramedic approached with a thermal blanket and a cup of hot soup from a thermos. The first taste of processed food in 3 months was simultaneously wonderful and nauseating. "There's going to be a lot of attention," the ranger warned as Ethan gathered his belongings. "News crews, probably. People are going to want to hear your story." Ethan nodded, though the idea of crowds and cameras felt more frightening than any bear or blizzard he'd faced. This place had stripped him down to essentials, had shown him what he was truly made of. The thought of returning to a world of schedules and small talk and indoor air seemed like stepping into an alien landscape. As they walked toward the helicopter, he turned for one last look at the homestead that had saved his life. The shelter would collapse under the weight of spring snows. Animals would reclaim the clearing. In a year, there would be little evidence that anyone had ever lived here. But he would carry this place with him forever, the knowledge that when everything was stripped away, he had found a strength he never knew existed. In losing everything, he'd discovered exactly who he was. The rescue helicopter's rotors grew louder, their rhythmic thump echoing off the mountain walls like a mechanical heartbeat. Ethan stood at the edge of his settlement, watching the aircraft circle once before finding a clearing to land 200 yards down the slope. Snow swirled in violent spirals beneath the blades, and he had to shield his eyes against the stinging wind. 3 figures emerged from the helicopter, 2 paramedics and someone in a ranger's uniform. They climbed toward him with urgent, practiced steps, their voices lost in the rotor wash until the pilot finally cut the engine. In the sudden quiet, Ethan could hear his own breathing, shallow and quick. "Ethan Morrison?" the ranger called out, still 20 feet away. "We're here to take you home, son." Home. The word felt foreign, like something from another language. Ethan looked back at his shelter, at the carefully banked fire that had kept him alive through countless frozen nights, at the meat drying racks and the water collection system, and the 100 small innovations that had become his world. This was home now. "I'm okay," he said, his voice hoarse from disuse. "I don't need—" "You've been missing for over 3 months," one of the paramedics interrupted, approaching with a medical kit. "We need to check you over, make sure you're not injured." Missing, as if he'd simply wandered off and gotten lost. As if every choice he'd made, every skill he'd learned, every night he'd fought to see another dawn had been an accident. Ethan stepped backward toward his shelter. "Where's my family?" The question came out harder than he'd intended. "Did you find them?" The 3 rescuers exchanged glances, and Ethan saw the answer in their hesitation. His chest tightened, but the grief felt distant now, muffled by months of acceptance and the strange numbness that came with having your worst fears confirmed. "The storm was unprecedented," the ranger said carefully. "Search and rescue teams have been looking, but they're not coming back." It wasn't a question. Ethan had known this truth in his bones since the first week, had built his entire survival around accepting it, but hearing it spoken aloud by strangers felt like a violation. The paramedic took another step forward. "Ethan, you're in shock. You need medical attention, proper food, warmth." "I have warmth." Ethan gestured toward his fire. "I have food. I have everything I need." They didn't understand. How could they? They saw a traumatized boy who needed rescuing, not someone who had been transformed by necessity into something harder and more capable than the teenager who had entered these mountains. They couldn't see the man his grandfather's teachings had forged in the crucible of absolute solitude. "Your Aunt Sarah has been worried sick," the ranger said. "She's waiting for you back in town. There are people who care about you, Ethan. People who want to help." Aunt Sarah. Ethan had barely thought about her in months, though she was his only remaining family. She lived in a small apartment in Asheville, worked double shifts at the hospital, knew nothing about wilderness or self-reliance or the kinds of truths you could only learn when everything civilized was stripped away. The helicopter pilot was growing impatient, checking his watch and scanning the darkening sky. Soon it would be too dangerous to fly in these mountains, and they all knew it. The paramedics were unpacking equipment, preparing to evaluate him whether he cooperated or not. Ethan walked to his fire and picked up a burning branch, holding it like a torch. The flame danced in the mountain wind, and for a moment he considered what would happen if he simply refused to leave. They couldn't force him, could they? This was his home now, his life, built with his own hands and sustained by his own will. But as he watched the strangers moving through his camp, professional, efficient, certain of their purpose, he realized something that cut deeper than the mountain cold. The boy who had needed rescuing was already gone. The person they'd found was someone else entirely, someone who no longer fit in the world they wanted to take him back to. He dropped the torch into the snow, where it hissed and died. "I need to gather some things," he said quietly. The ranger nodded with visible relief. "Of course, take whatever you need." Ethan walked through his settlement one final time, touching the walls of the shelter that had protected him, the tools that had sustained him, the carefully organized supplies that represented months of patient work. But what he really needed couldn't be packed or carried. What he really needed was already part of him now, carved into his bones by cold and hunger and the absolute requirement to endure. He picked up his grandfather's knife and slipped it into his belt. The helicopter's rotors began to spin again, and Ethan walked toward the machine that would carry him back to a world he no longer belonged to.